G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. In today's video we're going to take a look at a few ways to paint bases that represent natural materials using oil paints. I tend to gloss over bases in a lot of my videos, but they're an important part of any completed miniature, as they give us a glimpse into the world our character's in and can often tell a story all on their own. Whether you make your own bases or use pre-made ones like these from Secret Weapon Miniatures, we can use colour theory to show what we don't see, such as the weather or time of day, and subsequently set the mood for our piece. So here we have a shipwreck, a forest, some ruins, a jungle floor, and a graveyard. And the plan is to try to create a unique feel suitable to each environment while using a fairly focused palette. On the left of the palette I have out some light colours for our highlights: radiant blue, radiant white, brilliant yellow pale, radiant violet, and radiant green. Now you don't need these specific colours, and a lot of them can be approximated by mixing a bit of white into a darker paint, but I like having them for convenience. Yellow and red are out, though I'm not sure how much I'll use them. I'll be leaning more into browns like Burned Umber and Van Dyke Brown for earth tones, as well as yellow ochre. And I have some phthalo green, perlene black, and indigo out for greens and shadows. So let's get started. For our graveyard I want to create a slightly unsettling look, so we'll be laying a foundation of perlene black, which is a very dark green. I'll eventually be putting brown over it, but the hope is that the hint of green in the shadows will have things looking not quite right. I'm applying it with a decent amount of thinner here so that it gets into all of that sculpted texture, and I'm getting it everywhere, even on the stones. Once that's done, I immediately come in with my makeup sponge and wipe away that excess. This is so we're left with just a stain of green, which will influence our subsequent layers. I often get asked how long to leave a foundational layer before wiping it away. And while it's usually no more than 10 or 15 minutes to give it a chance to stain, I wanted to show that you can also dive right in if you press for time. Now that's done, I'm getting some burnt umber, and I'm not adding thinner here, as thick paint sticks over thin and vice versa, so this should adhere to the heavily thin foundation. I'm gently overbrushing it over the dirt, generally avoiding the stones, but not being too worried if some gets on there, since it is dirt after all. For the stones I'm grabbing some radiant violet. Purple and green are complementary colours, so if we mix them we should get a grey as they cancel each other out. There's still definitely some green coming through, but right away we're getting a distinct yet slightly wrong looking stone. We can add a touch more of that green to bring some shadow back, and then more violet to focus on the uppermost parts for the highlights. This sort of blocking in lets you quickly set the stage, while also accomplishing some blending, which is a real strength of oils. Now I can add a bit of white to catch those edges, and if I'm careful I can let the sculpt do most of the work for me, even with a big brush like this one. Then I take what's on my brush and mix it into that umber, to give us a unique yet cohesive tone for our skulls. I think of it as the same light affecting each object, letting the difference in base tones instead distinguish them. That being said, we need the dirt to be its own thing too, so I take some brilliant yellow pale into that mix and start overbrushing it. Being a cool yellow, combined with our green shadows, we can get a kind of eerie moonlit look in this way. Now to get some definition back, we can again work smarter instead of harder. By adding a lot of thinner to our darks we can make a wash, and by touching our brush to the sculpt we can let the recesses and capillary action do the work for us. Just like that, our tombstone's starting to pop, and we can suddenly read the inscription. Similarly, we can further separate our elements, such as the other stones and skulls, in the same way. From here it's a bit of back and forth, adding more targeted highlights with a smaller brush to further push that contrast, and letting our dirt creep up onto the stone so that it looks like it's more part of the environment. And one more wash on the tombstone to reinforce the letters and to create a greater sense of depth as it sinks into the earth. And we can call it done. I take a minute at the end to clean the outer edges with a makeup sponge, as wiping your rim is a great way to keep it presentable. So for some reason this ruined base made me think of a desert, so we're going to try to create that here. Gamblin's Van Dyke Brown is quite desaturated, which should help us get a dry, parched look to these stones. And while yellow ochre is still a yellow, it's similarly desaturated, and will hopefully make a good foundation for our sand. And since sand gets everywhere, we don't care if there's some overlap. As before, we immediately start wiping it away, and while yellow ochre isn't particularly staining, there's plenty left in those recesses that we can still use. Now here I'm mixing brilliant yellow pale into Van Dyke Brown, as this combo makes a nice grey, and I'm adding a touch of ochre too, just to give it a bit more colour. But I'm not happy with it, as I think that colour looks a bit too wet. I wanted you to see this to remember that the flexibility of oils really lets us lean into experimentation, and I can just take my makeup sponge and reset this whole area in just a couple of seconds. Now take two. I'm going to let the mini be the palette here and dive straight in with brilliant yellow pale. Now that's looking a lot more parched to me. We can take the same brilliant yellow pale and work it over the sand pushing the ochre further into the shadows and letting that cross-contamination work for us in the places where our two elements meet. And we can again use colour theory by adding radiant blue to our stones, as the resultant grey will both enhance that dry look and the slight cool tint will make them pop more against the warmer sand. Then we can add white to again push the dryness. This same base could have been painted like the last one and not looked out of place, and it's interpretation like this that can make basing be about so much more than just the physical model. And like before, we can use some washes to further separate our elements. By making the perpendicular planes of the stone so much darker, it also gives us the impression of a harsher, more direct sunlight. In hindsight, I could have used indigo here for a more natural looking shadow, but I do like how parched and dusty the Van Dyke brown appears here. So when researching for this video, I was surprised by how different sand can look in different environments. For the shipwreck base, we're going to try to make a more beach-like sand, using the same foundation as before. Ochre on the sand, but this time burnt umber for the wood. As long as this wreck has probably been baking in the sun, I wanted some saturation in the shadows, both for interest and to give the impression that it was a fairly recent thing. Unlike our desert sand, we're going to try to use blue instead of brilliant yellow pale for those initial highlights. Beach sand, particularly wet sand, can look quite grey depending on the time of day and the ambient light, so that's what we're going for. The ochre in the recesses should still help it read as sand as we build up these highlights. For the flotsam, some radiant violet should similarly desaturate the brown. I'm starting out on the edges, letting it blend in as I move inwards, to give the impression that things are drier at the extremities, and less so the closer to the wet sand. So more violet, followed by some white, should push this farther. Then some white into our blue for the highest parts of the sand, which I'm imagining are slightly above water. For the seaweed, I'm using phthalo green. Nothing fancy, and again some violet both to desaturate it and to tie it in with the planks. This cooler element really pops against the rest of the base, and the splash of green shows us that there's still some life here, further separating it from the desert biome. I'm going to try something different here and make a blue-grey wash for the sand. Washes don't always have to be dark, and oftentimes light will be reflecting strongly out of alcoves and recesses that we'd assume to be in shadow. Just a few touches of near colour to break things up and also to add to that waterlogged feel. And lastly, some stronger dark washes to make our wood really stand out. With just a few palette adjustments from our desert base, we have a largely dry scene, but this time in the suggestion of a wet environment. Next we're going to move into our forest, which I'm imagining to be quite lush on a warm day. Applying both Van Dyke brown and umber will help us easily modulate our browns, from a rich warm to a cooler dark. And even splashing a bit of pearline black on there will help give the impression of moss, grass, or reflected light from plants off screen. Mixing your foundational layer like this can be a lot of fun, and you can get some really interesting results by further mixing it as you wipe it away. We can dab our sponge on parts that we want a better control, but overall this method is great for enhancing complex, natural scenes. Here a touch of yellow into the umber gives us a nice golden brown, which will add some warmth and life to our stumps. The texture makes applying this easy, and we can gradually add more for the highlights, or switch over to brilliant yellow pale, or even white if we wanted to dry things out a little bit. That same brilliant yellow pale into the stone will make it look more at home, followed by some blue for some added colour and temperature contrast. I want our vines and leaves to stand out here, and for them to look alive, so I'm mixing some yellow into the phthalo green to warm it up. Having our organic elements be both warmer and more saturated like this helps pull the eye to them, and you can really see that on the vines covering the stone. Using brilliant yellow pale to highlight them again keeps our light more consistent. For the washes I wanted to focus more on the pearline black. Unlike the graveyard scene, the green in the shadows here gives more the impression of plant life, and it looks more at home. Again, context matters, and the same colours in different situations can convey completely different meanings. And we're done. Lastly, we're going to try to create a different kind of greenery, this time in a jungle. While forested areas can be quite shaded, jungle settings can take this to the next level, as a dense canopy can block out a tremendous amount of light. Even daytime scenes can appear largely in shadow, so I thought we'd go with some cooler tones to suggest that darkness. In addition to pearline black on top, I'm putting some indigo into the lower areas. The result is a mix of cold, desaturated greens and blues. So to bring some life back, we're going to need some warmer tones, like umber for the bare patch on the ground. Even an ordinary looking brown can pop in the right context, and spreading it around between the plants gives the eye places to move between. That said, I want the dirt to be the accent, not the main event, so some straight phthalo green over the leaves is the next step. Despite being a neutral green, it looks warm compared to our cool foundation. One way we can get some easy variety between our plants is to use different highlight colours. I'm broadly clumping these into two types, the narrow leaves and the broad ones, but you could really get granular with this. The first I'm highlighting with radiant blue, which while cool, still looks quite natural. By mixing in some yellow into the second kind, we really get some contrast in hue and temperature, and the way they're spread out around the base means we can get a pretty balanced result without too much effort. From here we can go back and forth with our highlights, paying attention to the shapes of the leaves and trying to catch where they're closest to the light rather than around all the edges. We also have some vines to take care of. Some yellow ochre will give us a bit of interest, but it's still quite warm, so a touch of dark will bring that down a bit, giving us just a hint of variety. Some brilliant yellow pale will give us a highlight without adding too much saturation, followed by a touch of violet, as even a slight purple-yellow contrast will help things pop. And here they are all together. A graveyard, desert, shipwreck, forest and jungle floor. In just a few minutes each, with only a few colours, we were able to make a diverse range of natural looking environments that I think look pretty alright. A bit of colour theory and reference study is all we need to make the difference between wet and dry sandy environments, or warm and cool wooded environments, or even the time of day. We can also take a relatively dull scene like a graveyard and make it interesting with subtle variations of colour that your brain will notice whether your eyes do or not. So let me know which is your favourite down in the comments, or if there's a particular environment you'd like to see in future. Thanks very much for spending time with me here today. If you have any questions about any of the products or techniques I've talked about, or have a topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, I'd love to hear it. If you'd like to see an extended version of this or other videos, I keep the raw footage over on my Patreon, where you can also get early access to future videos, and it's a great way to support the channel. Again, thanks very much for being here, and take care.